We're going to start in a second. There are a couple of folks that need to find their seats. Welcome to everybody. The class will go till about 5 minutes after 11. I want to thank Leslie for keeping us on time track, for Connie and Paul, who will run the microphones, and I just want to, after Jessica and Steve are finished with their presentation, I want to remind you that everybody wants to hear your question, so put your hand up, but wait for them to give you the microphone, ask your question, and make sure you give the microphone back. That will be important as we go along. I want to welcome you to the second of the forum. The response from Fran Diener's presentation last week was quite good. The number of people who attended with us was somewhere over 45 on live stream, so we're grateful for that, and we're live streaming this again, so we welcome those people who are with us for this. So we're going to begin. The way this will work is that Steve and Jessica will be making a presentation, so please hold your questions until after they're done, and then we will have a time for Q&A, and then we'll need to be leaving here about 5 minutes after 11 so that second hour worship or the 11:15 worship can begin. First, if you would just, without an introduction, because they are wonderful people and their light has come into this place, would you welcome Steve Ziekoff and Jessica Goebel amongst us? And we're grateful that they readily said that they would be here with us today. And let me give you a brief introduction of both of them. Jessica Goebel is related to this church, and we're grateful for that. She's the Director of Children and Family Ministries at the Onalaska United Methodist Church and is a delegate, a lay delegate, to this May's General Conference. She's married to Matt, and they have 3 children together. So we asked her to come, first of all, because she's related here, and we thought you might have a nice lunch waiting for you in Madison, but most specifically that you're part of the delegation that does an awful lot of work to get ready, and they know a great deal about the preparation. Steve is also well known here, traveled with us to England on that pilgrimage not long ago, but simply is well known. He's a retired clergy member of the Wisconsin Annual Conference. His last appointment was as conference benefits officer, been each of the past 7 general conferences, beginning in 1996, serving at 4 in staffing roles, excuse me, with GCF&A, Business Manager's Office, the Office of the Secretary of the General Conference, which means he knows the ins and outs backstage and in front of stage. An elected member of the preceding 5 Wisconsin delegations, he was a seated delegate in 2012, 16, and 19. He served as the delegation chair at the last General Conference for both the Portland and St. Louis sessions, resides in Lake Mills with his wife, Jane. Jane is here, right here. Good to see you. Jane Fulmer Ziekoff, who is also a retired Methodist, United Methodist clergy. We are just delighted to have you here, and without further ado, because they want to hear more from you, they've heard enough from me for a lifetime, but anyway, welcome Steve and Jessica in our midst.
Thank you, Mark. The worship service this morning was wonderful to be part of because it exemplified who we were known as historically as Methodists. We were always known as the singing Methodists. And we did that this morning. Again, the Brits would have referred to what we had today as a hymn sandwich. And I think Madison First might be one of the few places which has hymn sandwiches every Sunday. But I'm afraid to say, friends, that we're probably not going to be able to sing our way out of the impasse that we have been in as United Methodists. And as I was preparing for today, I was reminded of 3 popular songs from the late 70s and early 80s, which probably best encompasses the nature of the church as we prepare to go to Minneapolis. And some of you might remember these songs. We Just Disagree was done by Dave Mason. We finally have acknowledged that. And then Fleetwood Mac came back and said, "Go your own way." And that's the stage that's being set. But as goes on, anytime we have negotiations between various groups, there's a major factor out there that we can't ignore, which is Africa, which was the song done by Toto. So for you folks that are into the old music and turn on Magic 98 still on Saturdays for Saturdays in the 70s, there you go. We really can't talk about what's going to happen in Minneapolis without looking at what is the makeup of this General Conference. And Paula was handing out a sheet that I hope that you've all gotten in hands that we're going to look at very briefly, because the context that we so often lose track of here in the upper Midwest, except for folks like Mark, who led seminars to multiple general conferences and taught students and gave commentary about what was going on. He's seen this firsthand. Yes, the U.S. is still a major factor of what happens at General Conference, but we are an international church. And coming up at this next General Conference, a full 44% of delegates, voting delegates, at this General Conference will be from outside of the United States. And you can't overlook what that means, the dynamics for that. Mark's illustration about sitting under the banyan tree was so apropos this morning to remind us that we don't just function in the context of sycamore and maple trees. We don't just function in the context of snow and ice. We are a global church. And the quick breakdown, you can take these with you. 56% from the U.S., split down by jurisdiction. Those of us in the upper Midwest represent only 10% of the makeup, the voting delegates at General Conference. Africa makes up a full 32%. Across the continent of Africa, multiple languages involved, which entails translations for all delegates that are present at General Conference. From the Philippines, 6% of the makeup of a General Conference. From Europe, 5%, but it gets a little nuanced in Europe particularly because you have 14 voting delegates from the West and from the North who are very similar to us in terms of their socioeconomics and their theology, but then you have from the East and Eurasia, 26 voting delegates. And these are the churches that emerged post the fall of the Berlin Wall that separated East from West. Yes, we had churches there, but they started being alive again after that wall fell. And so the folks from the North and from the West tend to be more affluent and more liberal in their theology. The folks from the East and Eurasia tend to be poor financially and much more conservative in their theology, coming out of a very repressive time in the church history there. And then we also have 1% of our makeup from what's called concordant churches, where we have full voting delegates from folks that are from other churches, and they're laid out there. The smallest delegations that go to General Conference, again, remember there's 862 voting delegates total, are 2 per annual conference. 1 clergy, 1 lay. By the book of discipline, there has to be at least 2. The largest delegation at this upcoming General Conference will be 50 from North Katanga, which is part of the Congo area. 1 million United Methodists in the Congo. And the North Katanga Conference itself is eligible for 50 delegates. Wisconsin has 6. So when you're dealing with that kind of context, yes, our delegates are very important. I'm very proud of the years that I spent as a delegate to General Conference, but suddenly our influence starts to get diluted a bit when there's 862 and a delegation from North Katanga with 50. There has never been, since the formation of the United Methodist Church, a U.S. annual conference that had 50 delegates. That'll help put that in context for you. 2020 is the first time that Central Conference representation has initiated developing this type of proposal, which Fran outlined for you last week as the protocol in shorthand. It's still posted online, his presentation. If you happen to not be here last week, we're not going to try to duplicate that today. My job is to talk to you about what is the prospects of this being passed. This proposal was unique in that there were Africans and Filipinos and Europeans involved on the groundwork of developing what came to be called the protocol. The Africans and the Filipinos became very outspoken when we were in St. Louis about how they were tired of being treated the way that they were by colonialist attitudes within the United Methodist Church. The idea had always been, well, the American vote counts, the rest of you are along for a ride, vote the way that we tell you to vote, and everything will be just fine. And they got very vocal about no more will we let colonialist attitudes shape what we are all about as United Methodists. They've become very assertive about wanting future general conferences to not be so U.S.-centric, as it's talking about their issues that happen there, that they want the general conferences to be about all-inclusive global issues that affect United Methodists in Africa as well as United Methodists in Madison. A key element to keep in the context is we've sat on the front lines of these tensions and battles at the Global South Central Conferences. And Central Conferences are the annual conferences outside of the U.S., the Global South being south of the equator. Those churches and delegates are very committed to maintaining the unity of the church. For them, for us to be a single body is a very important concept. Hence, Bishop John Yambasu, who was the initiator of the conversations which result in the protocol, Bishop Yambasu being from Sierra Leone, have been painting this protocol, framing it as a way to maintain the unity of the church. Now that might sound counterintuitive when we are recognizing that there will be elements that split away, but what they're pointing out is the greater portion of the church will remain together and hence unify. A very important concept. Though the votes have not been tallied yet, it appears increasingly likely that many Africans will stay within what remains of the United Methodist Church because of a couple reasons. First, there's a high denominational value, identification placed in African, particularly with the cross and flame and the United Methodist Church name. Here sometimes, if somebody asks us, where do you go to church, we kind of mumble a little bit about United Methodist. They hold that proud in Africa. That means a lot when they're involved in mission work and in evangelism efforts, and they don't want to lose that identity. And the second issue has to do with the loss of mission funding should they break off from the United Methodist Church. And they're not quite so sure what it would mean to follow after a denomination that's being created by what's known as the Wesleyan Covenant Association. There has not been a new name identified for a denomination, but that is the group leading it. And there's too many questions, many more than answers around that, so they're not so sure they want to follow them outside the church. And very quickly, financially, this is what it could mean within the African annual conferences, and sure, finances aren't everything, but it enables ministry. And so we've got a situation where Nigeria and Congo are heavily dependent on mission funding. And moderately dependent are the Zimbabwe Annual Conference, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire, what we refer to in English as the Ivory Coast. And then working toward less dependence are Sierra Leone and Mozambique. Angola has already become somewhat financially dependent. And then we've got the situation in East Africa, which has been entirely cut out at the present time from United Methodist funding because of misuse of some of the funds that went over there, and a terrible situation still getting worked out. But those dynamics on funding affect how votes will be happening in Minneapolis. What is happening parallel to all this is a growing sense that we need to be establishing regional conferences around the world. We know the language of Central Conference within the hierarchy of the United Methodist Church, namely the churches outside the U.S. What they can do is change the book of discipline to meet their own missional needs. But the U.S. conferences, what are referred to as the jurisdictional conferences, have never had that privilege. And now the concept is growing. Maybe we need to have regional conferences so we're on a level playing field, and hence the U.S. church could deal with U.S.-centric issues. Each one of the regional conferences in Africa, the Philippines, and Europe could deal with issues that are pertaining to them. And only our basic issues about what our faith statements will be and our basic constitution and issues that govern the entire church would be dealt with at the General Conference level. Frankly, the people from outside the U.S. are getting tired of the once every 4 years battles that have been going on now, going back to 1972, about issues related to sexuality language. It was also rather embarrassing when we were at General Conference in Tampa to be sitting with the folks from Sierra Leone as we spent 3 hours debating a new pension plan that would only apply to clergy in the U.S. and would have no impact on anybody outside the U.S. A rather embarrassing situation, but under the current laws of the church, that was the only place that we could deal with that. There's also additional legislation still being submitted by what's known as the Christmas Covenant. It was initiated by Filipinos who also got Africans and Europeans involved, which was a whole issue around the unity of the church. And that was just passed this past week by what's known as the annual conference, the Philippines Annual Conference Cavite. They handle the name of their conferences a little bit differently in the Philippines than we do here. And so that's going on at General Conference, and even though the submission deadline was months ago for General Conference legislation, there's a provision that says if something is passed by an annual conference up until the end of March, it can still go to General Conference, which is what's going to happen. That same annual conference in the Philippines, the Cavite Annual Conference, also passed the entire package of the protocol legislation. There had to be a vehicle to get this before General Conference. It's happened once. It's going to happen at least 2 more times in early March when both the Michigan Annual Conference is going into special session and the Sierra Leone Annual Conference is having their regular session. And it's anticipated that both of them will pass the legislation so it will be properly before the General Conference in Minneapolis. One of the interesting things that's happened post General Conference in St. Louis was the pushback that happened in the U.S., particularly about the passage of the Traditionalist Plan. Rob Renfro, who is the president of Good News, has acknowledged publicly that their approach of, quote, unity through compliance was a failed strategy that resulted in it coming back, blow back into their face in ways they never anticipated. They really did. They really thought that if we can get everybody to comply, we're going to have unity of the church. And in fact, what it did is enabled all these other movements that were saying, this is not who we are as United Methodists. This is not what we're about. We are about the common good, as Mark was talking about today. We are about expressing the love of Jesus to everybody. So it's a very interesting acknowledgement on their part. One of the things to anticipate that should the protocol be passed in the form that it is, this will not guarantee that there will be a neat split between, quote, traditionalists and progressives. There are a significant number of traditionalists in the United States who, to begin with, do not feel comfortable with what the leadership of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, Good News, Confessing Movement, Institute on Religion and Democracy, they're not comfortable with the direction they're taking. They are folks who love their church as much as everybody in this room does here today. And they're not wanting to leave the United Methodist Church to go someplace else. So we should anticipate that a significant number of traditionalists, or otherwise known as evangelicals, will choose to stay within the United Methodist Fellowship in the post-General Conference Church. There also was a very poor lack of preparation of the Wesleyan Covenant Association leadership with their membership. They did not get them to fully understand that the end game all along for the WCA was to be able to leave the United Methodist Church with church property and other assets intact. I will apologize again publicly this morning to my LGBTQ brothers and sisters. The issue all along has never really been sexuality. It's been used as a wedge issue to divide the church around. There's been power games going on. There's been theological disagreements that go back to the formation of the United Methodist Church in 1968 that are far deeper than sexuality issues. And that issue has been used, unfortunately, to create a great deal of harm on people in the process of seeking another end, which was leaving the United Methodist Church. Should this pass, will there be annual conferences that will leave and become part of the WCA? Possibly a few. I've heard a number recently, a prediction of at least 12 annual conferences. Keep in context again, when you hear the number 12 annual conferences, that's not just U.S. annual conferences. It includes annual conferences outside the U.S. Within the U.S., some pretty strong signals that we could see Mississippi, the 2 Alabama annual conferences conceivably could leave fairly readily. We get up here to the north central part of the country, likely that none of our annual conferences would end up leaving the United Methodist Church. That's my crystal ball at this point. Hopefully you'll forget it if I'm completely off base. But that's my read, looking at several general conferences. Should more than one conservative denomination emerge, the proposed $25 million payment to the protocol would be split between 2. Or if there was 3 forms, there would be split 3 ways. So it's not $25 million per new denomination. It would be $25 million for those who would be considered traditionalists. The likelihood of a, quote, progressive or liberal denomination forming is very low. The reason being that the kind of groundwork that's been laid by the WCA has simply not been done among the progressives and liberals. And so there's not a high likelihood of a new denomination forming. Possible? You bet. Will there be individual congregations who will elect to leave under the provisions of a split? You bet. A full-fledged denomination, not in the immediate future. The last thing to point out about what's happened with protocol, which is really rather unique in recent church history. To this point, there's been groups that you would never imagine have aligning behind the same kind of proposal who have endorsed this group. As of the current time, the protocol proposal has been endorsed by the Confessing Movement, the Good News, Mainstream UMC, which is a centrist group, Reconciling Ministries Network, Uniting Methodists, which is another centrist group, UMC Next, which was a group that Adam Hamilton called together down at the Church and Resurrection. They created some possibilities for new legislation, which they submitted to General Conference. Now that group is saying we need to line up behind the protocol, and the Wesleyan Covenant Association. In summary, from where I stand, I think we will see some sort of split happen coming out of Minneapolis. The question is what form that split will look like once the General Conference completes its work.
Hello, all of you. My name is Jessica Goebel, and like Mark said, I am from Onalaska United Methodist Church up by La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I'm here to kind of talk to you about how I ended up standing up here talking to you today, and what that means, how I went from someone sitting in a pew just like all of you, lay people, to being elected to be a lay delegate for the laity portion of General Conference. So, starting back, I was watching some of the live stream of the General Conference in St. Louis, the special session, and kind of sat there with my mouth hanging open when the traditional plan passed. I had 2 kids in my house at the time. I have 1 college student up at the U of M, and I have a high school student and a middle school student, and both of them said, I think I'm done with the church. And I said, wait, nothing's happening tomorrow. But that just made me think of, our those generation, our younger people, and how they feel about what's going on. So I decided right then and there that the only thing I had 2 choices. I could sit there and be very angry and upset and sad. I've been a United Methodist since I was baptized. Or I could try to be in the midst of voting on this the next time. So I choose the latter, obviously. So I went through the process of being elected at our last annual conference last June as a voting lay delegate to this year's General Conference in Minneapolis. So now what does that look like? We have been meeting as a delegation since July. We meet once a month in Toma for 3 hours. And then there's several other speaking engagements like this one and informational sessions that will be put together by multiple delegates at a time. Most of the time, then you would see different places on the spectrum. So what does our delegation look like? We have, we started with 10 clergy, 10 lay. One of our laity delegates needed to step away for health reasons, so we do have an uneven number. We have 10 clergy and 9 laity. First thing we did was we had to pick our legislative sections that we were going to be in charge of to look at, digest, and bring back to our group. So contrary to some beliefs, that General Conference is much more than this protocol vote. So there's a lot of things that come to General Conference, and because of a law or a legislature that was passed in 2016, everything that is brought to the book, the big books that I get to read, everything has to be voted on at General Conference. All petitions that are submitted to General Conference need to be looked at. So there's a lot more going on. Probably the biggest thing that some of you may have heard of is the revising of the social principles. So that is 8 years in the making. A lot of those principles deal with some of the language that we hope to have taken out along with the protocol passing. And So we have, each one of us in the delegation have taken a spot or a legislative committee. There are 14 committees that will meet during the first week of General Conference to go through all those petitions and determine what is going to go to the floor of General Conference to vote as a large body of those 800 plus delegates. So I have Church and Society 1. It deals with a lot of the climate change petitions. It deals with a lot of the environmental things, poverty, things like that. So in our delegation, like I said, there's 19 of us. We do have a couple that are more the traditionalist side, and we have a bunch that are in the centrist to moderate progressive side, and we have a couple that are more on the liberation edge. So we do have a wide spectrum in our discussions, and we have to approach those with grace and love and kindness, and try to work together as a delegation. So my responsibility is to read about 1,200 plus pages of legislation and specifically being really able to understand and devote my attention to my legislative section. One thing to note is that once you're at General Conference, lay and clergy, they have the equal amount of voting. So it's a very empowering and a very humble honor to be part of this delegation and represent Wisconsin as one of 6. And my vote means the same thing as one of the clergy votes at General Conference. Currently, we are all digesting the legislative portion of that protocol. It came out about a week and a half ago now, and it's 33 pages in length that describes really how everything is broken down. If you're interested in a lot of reading, you can find that online. You can also find a Q&A breakdown of that legislature as well. And like Steve said, that legislature has been already passed by one conference in the central conferences, and will be going to Michigan and Sierra Leone to get that petition or that legislature to General Conference. We have not taken a straw vote with our delegation, mainly because we are all just reading the legislature of that protocol. But as a entirety, I'm pretty sure most of our delegation would vote in favor of passing that protocol. Another thing to note that we are discussing at our meetings is jurisdictional conference, which takes place in July. That's where we elect our bishops. So one thing to note is that we have 2 bishops retiring in our north central jurisdiction, and we will be replacing 1 of those bishops. So we will be going down a bishop. We currently have 6, we will have 5. And that could mean that the Wisconsin Annual Conference may end up being combined with another conference. We are the smallest annual conference within the North Central jurisdiction. There have been several bishops or potential bishops endorsed by the North Central jurisdiction, and those are online as well. You can find those in United Methodist News articles. And so we are also part of our delegation going through those profiles and educating ourselves on who potential bishops could be to replace the bishop. I'm learning a lot at our meetings about networking. Like Steve said, there's been a lot of organization within the WCA and the more traditionalist movements of the United Methodist Church. And not so much, I'm learning, with the centrist progressive side. And that has definitely been a goal for this year's delegation, is to get more organized and more networking and work together more as a group. At first thought, I would think the central conferences would be not entirely excited about changing our stance with our book of discipline with the language with human sexuality. But as Steve also talked, you know, keeping that part of the church, the majority of the church together allows for the funding to continue in a way that is more like it is now, and may not be ideal for having a split. So we are learning in our delegations about networking with other groups that are there. Some groups that you probably know about are like the Reconciling Ministries Network will probably have some teams there, and just some of the other more centrist progressional groups, organizations that have worked very hard to understand what's going on and talk to people and try to have people on the same page. One question I had with the protocol, and this was talked about last week with Article 6 of that protocol, talks about hoping to have a book of discipline without the restrictive language and allowing for all clergy to be able to be ordained, not regardless of their human sexuality stance. And that language did not make it into the protocol legislation. And one of the reasons for that is if the protocol passes, then that allows for a lot of that other stuff to take place in a timely fashion. There is also legislation coming that does deal with that. The social principles talks about taking, the section on marriage does take out that language, man and woman. And the connectional tables proposal of the regional conference would allow the U.S. then to be their own conference and be able to make some of those decisions within our conference. And then, as Steve alluded to, the Christmas Covenant is another one that discusses making that conference be the U.S. can have their own and have the ability to speak to that. So that's pretty much all I have for my end of the talking about delegation.
Are not alternate delegates elected, one general conference delegates, and so why would you be down to 19?
Good question. That 19 does encompass all the delegates. So what it looks like is there are 6 general conference voting delegates, 3 clergy and 3 laity. And then there's also 6 jurisdictional conference delegates who are alternates to general conference as well. So there's 3 clergy and 3 laity, so that adds up to 12. And then there are 4 alternate delegates for both clergy and lay, which ends up being 20. So when we have 19, those elected were at annual conference, so we would have to have another annual conference to replace that one person. One thing to keep in mind, so they just don't. But one thing to keep in mind is that, so on the table, or on the voting floor, there's only 3 and 3. 3 lady, 3, so it's a total of 6. So if one of us steps aside, then the next one comes. So basically, we would have to go through 8 or 6 people not being able to be on the floor to get to that down number 10 or 20, okay?
We weren't at the meeting last week, but what's the Reader's Digest version here? What's the impact on this church? What are we going to do, and how does it affect our finances, the property, and so forth? In 10 words or less.
The quick answer, Reader's Digest, you don't have to do a darn thing. And I'll do that again. I knocked my thing off. The quick Reader's Digest answer is you don't have to do a darn thing here. Only churches that want to leave the denomination under the current language would be required to take any vote. Churches that wish to stay within the United Methodist Church aren't going to have to do anything. and there's thresholds that have to be reached to even call for a vote in a local congregation. There's a lot of my clergy colleagues out in the audience today. They'll tell me if they think I'm crazy, but my sense is that the Wisconsin Annual Conference, as an annual conference, will certainly stay within what's known as the United Methodist Church, if there's not a large enough number of folks that would have an interest in leaving. So First Church, for folks that are totally oblivious to what's going on in General Conference, won't feel a lot different come June 1st and won't feel a lot different come January 1st of next year. That the very effective ministry that you have going on here is going to pretty much look the same. Is that fair, Pastor? Yeah.
Is there any speculation as to what other conference Wisconsin would join, and because we're the smallest?
First, I'm going to clarify one phrase that Jessica used, and she's not the only one that gets confused about that. When we talk about Wisconsin needing to leave, join another annual conference, this is not a merger of annual conferences. We're very familiar in Wisconsin with 2- and 3-point charges on churches. Madison first is very blessed to be a 1-point charge. Mark has 1 church to worry about. In a 2-point charge, which are not too far from here, the pastor has 2 churches to worry about. And that's what we would be talking about, is a 2-point charge where Wisconsin would continue as the Wisconsin Annual Conference, and another annual conference would continue, and we would split the time of a bishop. Mm-hmm. There's various conversations about what that might be. I'm not privy on the front end of the conversations that count. I'll just say this much, that the second smallest annual conference in terms of membership now in the jurisdiction is Northern Illinois. Now, the smallest is Dakotas, but Dakotas and Minnesota already share a bishop. Dakotas Conference, Minnesota Conference, 1 bishop. Michigan came together recently, so that's now 1 annual conference with 1 bishop. Conceivably, we could get hooked in with Michigan, but we've got a major geographical issue if we ever did that. It's called Lake Michigan. It's not, it seems to be a little bit of a stumbling block, except when we relate to the Yoopers, who are actually Wisconsinites in disguise, but I won't chase that one any further. It's also conceivable, if we did a geographical pairing, that we could end up with another bordering state, Iowa. And I've said to several folks, my personal challenge with that, and I love the folks from Iowa, my wife's from Iowa, Iowa ordained me, but I also know what it means to get from Council Bluffs to Green Bay. And so that's an argument against Iowa. So the quicker answer is we don't know yet.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah.
Is there a target date for dealing with human sexuality in these protocols?
Well, let me try to answer that in terms of what I think you're asking. And correct me if I'm misunderstanding the question. Should the protocol legislation start working its way through General Conference, right at the General Conference in Minneapolis, the hateful language, the negative language could all be removed by the General Conference in Minneapolis. In terms of freeing up to get even more progressive language, we'd be looking at a subsequent General Conference, because there's not complete packages of other language that's going before that. Now, the unknown around the General Conference is it appears that we would likely have another special called General Conference post-Minneapolis to sort out the post-Minneapolis United Methodist Church. That has not been a date set. It has not been called by the bishops. It's kind of everybody's waiting to see what really happens in Minneapolis. At a minimum, the next time the General Conference would meet would be in 2024. My hunch is that we will see another special called session of some sort in between 2020 and 2024. And I'm really not trying to be evasive with my answer, but that's about the best I can say to you right now.
Wisconsin has already scheduled a special annual conference. We have our normal annual conference in June, which is ended up being like 3 weeks right after the general conference is done. And we have a special one-day annual conference already scheduled for September 12th, just to continue to mull over some of this and also to pass our budget.
I'm really, Mary Lou Taylor, I'm really a little confused about the timeline here, because if the proposal passes, is there anything in the legislation that says that the new United Methodist Church, or that there is a jurisdiction, a regional jurisdiction, and the U.S. is a regional jurisdiction? Is that in the legislation?
It is not.
No. So that's aspirational. That's like they hope that that would happen at the next general conference.
Not necessarily, because there are several petitions that would possibly allow for that already in the legislation.
Right, but none of that has passed for 48 years. So I'm not really expecting that this general conference will take out any of the negative language, the things that have harmed LGBTQ brethren for 48 years. I'm not convinced that this general conference is going to be different than the last one or the one before that or the one before that. So if we were to be in favor of this proposal, what assurance do we have that the new United Methodist Church is going to be any different than the one that we have now, that's going to discriminate against our gay and lesbian?
I would say, because if the protocol, within the language of the protocol, it has the traditionalists exiting with that funding, and also because as a whole, the central conferences, and Steve talked about this, they really want to stay together, and they know to stay together that that would need to happen, is have the United Methodist Conference, because otherwise a lot of the U.S. conferences will not want that to happen. So I think I would say a lot of the central conferences are thinking about supporting something that in the past they may not have supported.
I am a little confused, because Steve had just said that most of the tradition, or that he thinks many of the traditional churches will stay in the United Methodist Church. And I doubt seriously if their delegates would vote any differently than they do now, and that the central conferences don't want us to have a regional jurisdiction. So I guess I'm really concerned about what the church would look like, and if it doesn't happen until the next general conference in 2024, it will be past any deadline for churches to leave the denomination.
Yeah, real quick response, Mary. Yep. I'll talk to you out in the hall. Glad to do it.